Thank you very much. Tiago Falsao, thank you. Sergey Suarez, Magdi Martinez, Soliman, ladies and gentlemen in the audience. I'm very happy to be here. This is my first time in your country, in Brazil, so it has some special significance for me. And I'm also delighted that the very first occasion is on a topic of great importance, the conference today. So I would like to thank participants from the government, from other organizations, and also the World Bank, the office here, for organizing this. I have an indirect connection with Brazil from my childhood because I grew up in the city of Calcutta in India. And what Brazilians may not know, but is true, every time there is a World Cup football match, Calcutta begins to look like a Brazilian city. People put on the Brazilian colors, the names of the Brazilian players are all over the city. So on its own, it adopts that persona. So every 4 years, growing up in that city, I would get a couple of days of a very Brazilian feeling. So thank you again for giving me the opportunity to speak on this very important topic. Okay, let me get myself. Yes, thank you very much. We can hold it there for a while. I'm going to speak to you to the topic that is being discussed here about the possibility of ending poverty. And to the question asked for this session, the answer is a qualified yes, it is indeed possible. But a lot depends, of course, on what you mean by poverty, how you define that. And I've been told that you have already had sessions, discussions on the meaning of where you draw the line, how you define poverty, how you track it. The World Bank last year formally adopted 2 goals broadly related to poverty and inequality, which will be the mission goals of the World Bank Group. That is what the World Bank is after. When I joined the World Bank 2 years ago, roughly 2 years ago, this debate was taking place. I was very much a part of this debate. So I want to begin by telling you a little bit about what the 2 mission goals of the World Bank are and why they are what they are. The 2 goals are, you can see one of them. I cannot read it, but I'm assuming most of you can read that. The goal number 1 is the end of extreme poverty, which we define by per person income of less than $1.25 a day. End of that kind of poverty by the year 2030. 2 small qualifiers. By the end of poverty, we do not mean 0. You will not get it to 0. There is war, there is strife, there are epidemic breakouts, there are fragile states where it's very difficult to intervene. So some poverty will remain. So when we say end of poverty, we mean global poverty less than 3% of the global population. The first question that arises, and indeed it would arise in Brazil, is why do you draw the poverty line so low, $1.25 a day? In Brazil, the population below that line is very small. It's actually down to now just above 3%. So the question does come up, why draw it so low? The answer to that is clear enough. We draw it there for one reason, is historically, we have used $1.25 as the line for quite some time. And over time, when you're tracking poverty, it is best not to change the yardstick too many times. So that was number 1. Once you've got it at a particular line, unless there is a compelling reason to change, keep it there track other forms of poverty, of course, but that one target, let's keep it there and try to see where it goes. But another one is even more important. The poverty line is indeed very low, $1.25 a day. But in the world today, 1 billion people, that is 1/7 of the world population, is below that line. The fact that most of you will not know anyone below that poverty line, most of us, no matter where we are in the world, people who participate in discussions like this, most of them will hardly know anyone below that poverty line, but 1/7 of the world is below that poverty line, which shows what a segregated world we live in, that you don't even know 1/7 of the world population, but it's a large enough number. So that is what we are tracking in terms of the end of poverty. But it was felt, and I felt this very strongly, that you want the World Bank to be engaged, not only in countries where there are lots of people below that line, such as in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, you have lots of people below that line, but you want the World Bank to be engaged with countries in Latin America, where this number has gone down, China, where the number is going down very, very quickly. And as far as I'm concerned, I believe that the bank can be engaged even in high-income countries having temporary problems using some other criterion. What should that be? And that led to the second goal. We'll stay there, yes. Yes, I'm trying to see if I follow it in Portuguese, but I don't, but I'm sure what it says is what I want to say. The second goal is that we will pursue the welfare and well-being of the bottom 40% of any population. So take any country, focus on the bottom 40%, and their well-being is something that we will be specially engaged in. And we put it a bit formally. We do say that we will try to push up growth of the bottom 40%, the growth of the per capita income of the bottom 40% of every population. Now, extreme poverty can go to zero in many countries, but the bottom 40% will never go to zero, by definition. So every country has a bottom segment that demands some special attention. And there can be very interesting debates. When in the World Bank we were talking about this, there were some country representatives who were arguing that, look, when you begin to focus on the bottom 40% vis-a-vis the average performance, some of us may look worse than other countries, but we are not really doing worse. Two examples. Both China and India, the bottom 40% is growing slower than the top 60% in China, likewise in India. But both these countries would argue that though our bottom 40% is growing slower than our top 60%, our bottom 40% is growing faster than the bottom 40% in most countries in the world. That is true. But there is still some scope for engaging in intelligent discussion that is that good enough, and the standard of living, especially of the bottom 40% and the spread, even if it is growing, shouldn't there be special attention over there? There are many things on this that can be discussed. I don't want to spend too much time, but two more points I will make over here. One of them is that some economists have pointed out that in most countries, if you take away the top 10% and the bottom 40% and leave the 50% between these two, their share is relatively constant. So in most countries, the big drama is taking place between the bottom 40% and the top 10%. So there is a bit of a natural cutoff at bottom 40%, focusing on that, so we played into this. Another reason for this engagement with each country's bottom 40% is I have recently been traveling a lot in Europe. And some of the European countries that are having difficulty in today's Eurozone crisis situation, they are very worried about their bottom segment. There are countries with unemployment just shockingly high. I've been in Greece recently, where you have over 25% unemployment. Youth unemployment is over 50%. In these countries, when you're talking about fiscal policy, to me it seems some of the debate in terms of fiscal austerity or no austerity is a relatively uninteresting debate. The biggest focus ought to be on what kind of fiscal policy and who takes the burden of fiscal adjustment. In these Eurozone countries, there has to be fiscal adjustment. Who shares this is the big question. And again, with our 40% criterion, the second one, there is scope for engagement in these countries as well in terms of policy. That is not my topic here. If you have questions, I'll come back to that. I do take a lot of interest now in fiscal policies and countries which can be middle income, high income, and the challenges. But let me now show you in terms of where the world stands in terms of poverty today. Yeah. Luckily, the numbers look the same, so we can work with this. So, as I told you, you can see from the right-hand side, the poverty in the world by this very low poverty line is 1 billion, just a bit over 1 billion, but this was in the year 2011. The last year for which we have proper data from around the world is 2011. But that's a reasonable good indication because the percentage of people below the poverty line is not like a stock market indicator. It does not fluctuate widely. If it is 1.01 billion, it will be a little bit less, hopefully by now, but it's roughly there. And the percentage of the world population is 14.5. In the LAC region, it is 4.6. In Latin America, it is basically 4.6, the poverty percentage. Sub-Saharan Africa, the percentage is highest, 46.8. Let me now see to the next one. How did we come here where we are? So the last column is roughly what we had. I've put in a couple of other countries over there. I want to show you how we have come to be where we are, 14.5. We are starting in 1980 when poverty was 43.4%, 43% basically, very high poverty in the world. Close to half the world population was below this shockingly low poverty line. It has been coming down since then, and if you look at the last column, there are some countries where it is very high. Democratic Republic of Congo, 87.7%, below this shockingly low poverty line. So close to 90% of the population living there. And look at Brazil, it's 4.5, and Brazil, we know, there is fresh data for 2012. It is down to now 3.8 or so in 2012. There's also some even more recent data, but that needs expertise to go into. 3.8 in 2012 is the Brazilian data. Now, if you use policies as usual, will you get there? And I will now go to the next page. There it is. Don't look at the last line. That needs a lot of detailed discussion. I will not go into that. The other three lines, let me explain. The number that we are trying to get to, 3% goal, means 252 million people, less than 252 million people below the poverty line. We did two scenarios at the World Bank. One is, you take all countries in the world, make them grow from now till 2030 at the same rate which they grew over the last 20 years. Hold income distribution constant. You will then reach 573 million people below the poverty line. So growth, as usual, will not get you there. Last 20 years' growth, however, was not as good as. The second line needs a little correction. We are looking at the first decade of this century. So 2000 to 2010, most actually developing countries were growing very well. The last 1 year, they were having problem, but bulk of this time, they were growing well. If you take this high growth and again project forward, you will come down to 405 million people living in poverty. So you will not get there. What this suggests, and that's what I'm going to, you can switch to the next page and remain there for a while because I'm going to now speak on this. Actually, there's more to it, so don't waste your time reading about it. I'll tell you what's there. I want to discuss now policies. If growth alone is not going to do it, what is it that we should turn to? First of all, let me tell you one logical mistake, plain simple logical mistake people make. It is true that if you look at the previous 2 decades or so, you will find that more than 75% of the poverty reduction took place because of growth. So the poor people who have come out of poverty, more than 75%, actually 77% did it because of growth. From that finding is actually very robust. From that, some people conclude that therefore it shows it is growth that leads to the end of poverty. Therefore, we should rely on growth. But that makes a big mistake because the fact that in the past, 75% of the end of poverty took place because of growth does not tell you anything about what other policies were tried and how many times. If nothing was tried, only growth, then whatever poverty reduction took place would have been because of growth. So it does not say that that is the best way to get at poverty. I'll make the logical mistake even clearer. Suppose in the old Soviet Union, USSR, in the 1980s, an economist was studying employment creation. He studies his own country's data and finds out that over the last 2 decades, 90% of jobs were created by the state, by the government. By the same logic, you would conclude, therefore, you have to rely only on the state or virtually only on the state for job creation. That would be a mistake. Exactly the same mistake, because if you've tried very little else, then of course 90% of the jobs that were created by the state, but you didn't try other things enough. So all I'm saying is that from the analysis of past data to go project forward, there is scope for intelligent analysis, and you may come out with novel policies. Having said that, and I'm going to go into policy discussion, but let me point to one important thing. The fact that growth alone is not enough does not mean that I am putting growth aside. I used to be the chief advisor to the Indian government, and I know that if you are living in an emerging economy, in a developing economy, growth is extremely important. So don't make a mistake about that. You have to stress on growth, and in fact, in Brazil, which has had some periods of remarkable growth, I remember from the late 1960s through the 70s, Brazil was growing at a phenomenal rate. It was also had faster growth in more recent times, though the last 1 year I know has been very difficult for you. I don't want to put that aside as unimportant. Growth is extremely important, and you have to be engaged in policies to get that going. But for poverty eradication, which is what this conference is, growth is important, but there are also other things which are important. What are these other things? And I want to spend a little bit of time on that. 2 other things I will talk about, and there is a third one, but I can cut that out depending on how I'm doing for time. 2 policies. The end of poverty is not simply a matter of determination. If it was just determination and courage and you can put an end to poverty, poverty would have come to an end by now. it does need a lot of professional input and a lot of thinking as to how you devise schemes to put an end to poverty. First lesson, which is very mainstream economics I'm bringing, incentives matter. When you intervene trying to put an end to poverty, you have to keep in mind that there are players from not only the poor, but even the civil servants, government people who are carrying out your program, they all have their incentives. And you have to devise a scheme whereby the leakage is minimal. There are developing countries where there is effort to reach food to poor people. One method which is very often used is the government goes, buys food from the farmers, and then gives this food to poor households at below market price. Studies show when you use this method, the leakage is huge. Why? Because after the government has acquired the food, given it to thousands of shops all over the country, and told these shops, sell them below the market price to the poor, the incentive for the shopkeepers not to do that is very high. And what you very often get is these shops will sell off a part of this food at the market price, and when the poor come, will tell these poor people that, sorry, we have run out of food. So what do? This is something to think about, but I feel it's in general better, not always the case, but in general, it is better to give the subsidy directly to the poor instead of giving it to the shop and telling the shop to give it to the poor. Give people the buying power, and wherever possible, let them buy it at the market price from the market. And let the private sector do the delivery of the food from the farm to the doorstep of the poor. So I'm not saying that the government pulls out. The government has a very important role, but give the subsidy directly to the poor and let the poor get benefits out of this. I know that certain conditional cash transfers have been used very successfully in your country. And I have to say, when I was in India, I would very often ask my office to check up what was happening in Brazil, because you've had a really successful set of interventions. So these interventions have to be, the incentive compatibility has to be worked out very carefully. But that is not enough. There is another problem which needs a lot of professional thinking and also common sense and judgment. This is the following, that the economy is a very strangely interconnected machine. You can intervene in 100 villages, get good effect in 100 villages, but that can have a negative byproduct far away. Let me give you a concrete example. Suppose you've decided that the government is going to inject employment, create employment in 1,000 rural areas. So you choose 1,000 rural areas in Brazil, and you create jobs. The government goes in, the government employs people. If this is implemented properly in these 1,000 rural areas, when you send in researchers to do randomized control trial and see the effect of this, you will find the effect has been good. People's nutrition level will be better, they will be better off. But this misses out on one important macroeconomic complication. When you intervene in 1,000 villages by injecting buying power, you may affect prices across the country. So far away, 1,000 miles away, in another village, which has nothing to do with your program, people may find that the price is rising slightly. And those people may become worse off, and some of them may tip back into poverty. This is a complication which is strange to economics and to do with the interface between micro interventions and macroeconomic fallout in other parts. All I can say, we cannot go into details of this, but this is something that you have to be alerted to and pay special attention going into this kind of a policy exercise. That when you intervene micro interventions, even if those interventions are good in those areas, you can have negative macroeconomic effects far away, and you do need a level of analysis to make sure that the macro balance across the country is being held together. And when you go into detailed analysis in Brazil or India or China, this is very important that when designing anti-poverty programs, you keep the entire economy together in mind when you do your analysis. The details of this I cannot go into. Let me go in to the last page, if you just switch over and past. Yeah, I'm going to make one point about inter-country. This is the last page. Inter-country program, which is important with this little picture. Let me actually just put it in words. In today's world, I'm sorry, I will disappoint you because I will not get to this. Yes, I will need exactly 5 minutes. I will not make use of this, but I'll tell you verbally what it's saying. So there is the micro-intervention and the macroeconomy, but there is also, in today's world, a problem of inter-country interaction, which is becoming more and more important because we live in a globalized world. Again, when I used to do my India work, very often in G20 meetings, I would find myself with the emerging economists in G20 meetings talking about some of our collective problems. What was the collective problem? Very often when you have rich countries interfering in their markets, trying to get their markets going, in the olden days, the effect would be on their markets. They would get inflation, they would get growth. Nowadays, you find that when you inject liquidity into your market, whether it be Japan or Europe or the United States, you don't get that much growth out of the injection of liquidity. You don't get inflation either out of the injection of the liquidity. One of the reasons is we live in a globalized world, and a part of this liquidity flows out to faraway countries. And so you may get inflation taking place in Vietnam, in Brazil, in India, in Turkey, which is to do with global injections taking place. Increasingly, this problem of global coordination of policy is becoming very, very important for the world. Even in terms of poverty eradication, this crops up. Certain problems, like if you're doing a taxation policy, a simple tax, you're not talking of a big tax, to use to transfer some money to the poor. Competition can break out between countries whereby you use the lowering of tax rates to capital or something else, and the independence of countries go. We've seen this happen in OECD countries. OECD reporter talked about this, that corporate tax rates are very often an inter-country instrument. You lower your corporate tax rate in order to attract global capital. Once this game starts up, it's very difficult for you individually to conduct a policy. So whether it be anti-poverty policy, development policy, monetary policy, there is greater need for global coordination. One area where this is, of course, beyond the reach of any single government, but this is where an organization like the World Bank, several UN organizations, the IMF, which work with inter-country policy matters, have a major role to play. I do believe, not because I work in the World Bank today, that these inter-country matters have become so important that there is a special responsibility now with these organizations to do a minimal amount of coordination in terms of global policies so that there isn't excessive tax cutting, which can be bad because you're doing it for some good, but together you do worse. This is meant to show this. It's in a paper of mine. I will not go into it, but there is reason for the use of inter-country policy coordination. So finally, to end, where we stand today in the world, poverty has gone down, but still it's very high. 1 billion poor people below this line of $1.25 is unacceptable. Really, it's morally unacceptable having so many poor people. You want to attend to that, but there are also countries where that kind of extreme poverty is virtually coming to an end. Brazil is an example of that. But you still have people who are at very low levels of income, very poor quality of life, standard of living. You want to attend to that. And you want to attend to that, you need, part of it is, of course, you need the rich and the elites to be conscious about this. I have no doubt that if poverty was a communicable disease, something you could contract from others, by now we would have acted much more severely on poverty because the elite would be much more worried about that. So the elite concern is important, But even the concern in itself is not enough. You need incentive-compatible policies, interventions to get to that. Incentive-compatible policies are not enough because there's also a macroeconomic dimension you have to keep in mind. And finally, there is reason to want a minimal amount of global policy coordination to get to this. So the agenda is huge, but the problem is a challenge that all of us should collectively share. Thank you very much.